And all right, so today I'm joined by Pandium's co-founders. So we have Christina Flashin, our CEO, and Sean Urbas, our CTO. And just to get started, guys, maybe you can give us kind of your brief bio, quick intro on your background and experience when it comes to integrations.
First,
Yeah.
uh, thank you so much, Lindsay, and hello to everyone who is watching us live, and we'll see this after it's been recorded. So my name is Christina, CEO here at Pandium. I personally have worked in the integration space in first enterprise software, and more recently in SaaS and startup land for over 20 years, and have used, I think, every kind of iteration of integration technology that has existed since the early 2000s. I could talk to folks about, Microsoft's long abandoned workflow management tool all the way up to MuleSoft and sort of the more recent generations of those types of platforms. It's a passion of mine for whatever weird reason. It's not a passion of most people's, but I'm excited to talk to Sean about this. You guys are getting a little glimpse into not only what it's like for the people that work here at Pandium to work with Sean and I, but also some of the reasoning, hopefully, behind why we started the company, to try to provide an alternative to some of the existing, more legacy approaches to application integration. So excited to talk today. Sean, you want to go?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Urbas. Sorry, this is one of my first ones of these webinars, so it's really exciting for me. In terms of my longevity, my career, I've been doing this over 25 years now. It seems the work is basically the same always. It's like take one data from one system and put data into another system, and in between do some magic to make it so that they all fit, put the square into the circle and whatnot. In terms of like the technology space, similar to Christina, I started out specifically with iPasses a little over 10 years ago. First time I touched one was uh, MuleSoft, and it did what it did. It left some stuff to be desired, and it was really something that, looking at what I was doing even before then in terms of moving data, I didn't understand why it had to be so different moving data in such a system. And so it's a big part of why we met and started Pandium.
Cool. All right. Thanks for those. So let's just talk agenda real quick so everybody kind of knows where we're going with the conversation today. So we're just going to start off with overviews. We'll give the big picture on no code integrations and then code first integrations, and maybe chat through some of the options that kind of lie in between those two options. And then we're going to walk through pros and cons of each approach and how people can decide which of those is right for the unique needs that they have within their business. And then we'll talk through creating a strategic integration plan and how people can introduce that plan and start to get buy-in from either execs at their company or other departments that they might need to support them as they're executing on that plan. And so basically our goal for today is that everybody's going to walk away with a much clearer picture on which integration strategy is right for them, and then be able to articulate the strengths of that plan to others. So let's kick it off with no code integrations. So can one of you just give us a brief high level overview on what no code integrations are, and then maybe your opinion on why it seems like they've become so popular in recent years?
Yeah, I'll start. um, so no code, hashtag no code is definitely a popular thing that has sort of even gained popularity over the last, I'd say, 5 years. Although the idea of like no code in integrations has actually been around for a lot longer than the sort of general no code space where you see, CMSs like Webflow for marketing folks. You see products like Bubble that are for building applications generally without using code. The integration space has had this concept of like workflow management for a really long time, like dating definitely back to the early 2000s, could have even been the late 90s. And when we're talking about integration specifically, which is what we'll cover here, typically no code integrations are going to be a way to get data from one system into another without having an engineer being involved. So we're going to either have sort of a canvas where you start from scratch and you're using blocks to represent different like ETL or data translation functions to massage the data from one system and move it into another. If it's not a canvas, sometimes there's just like a lot of options that you're selecting from, like if then types of things. And those types of tools are really focused on helping non-engineers, citizen integrators, operations folks at companies more easily kind of consolidate their own business functions and not have to be doing as much copy pasting across and importing of spreadsheets and things like that. Sean, do you want to talk about why you think these are important? I could talk about this specific topic for
let's say pros and cons till let's just cover the high level on what both options are, and then we'll kind of dive into pros and cons, because I know you both have very strong feelings about this. So Sean, maybe you can just give us high level, what are code first integration? Code first tools or integrations in general.
If we stick to integrations, I like to think of it as a spectrum. So Christina was talking about the no code side of it, where it's like you're just drag and dropping your way, and it's all the way to you're writing custom code for every connection that you need to make. You're like opening up. I'm a developer, so as a developer, I would open up a new terminal window and start bashing away on Python on between the two APIs, and then somehow just throw that up there and get that running and working. I think with the no code, it takes away not only the code aspect, but also a lot of the operations and the platform where you need to run the actual integration. There's a lot that happens there, and people don't usually think about when they're using these tools. And so I think without getting into the pros and cons, there's a spectrum, and I will say, like, we're not fully one side or the other. There's different parts of Pandium that do different things. In terms of the integrations and writing of the business logic, we're very much code first. So we want you to write that in code. It's going to be the best way to express what you're trying to do.
Cool. Yeah, and so, like, to be clear, like, Pandium is a code first integration tool, obviously, right? But today we are trying to kind of give people the overview on everything so that they can pick which is right for them. We definitely are going to sway on the side of, we think code first is right for most companies, but we are also aware that sometimes no code maybe is the best option for people. And so you had kind of talked about your idea of the integration spectrum. And so, kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, but how I think about that is, like, if everything's on a line, on one side we have no code, and then on the other side we have full code, and in between there are some other options. So the ones that I think of are like a unified API or an iPaaS tool. Is that kind of how you think about it, or are there any other kind of steps along the way that people might need to be aware of?
No, I very much think those are two big, like, mileposts on that metaphorical spectrum. That you can get into shaving, like, what is even a unified API? This recently came up in a conversation where the responses and the requests were all the same, but like the end user's code wasn't like the unified shape. So it's like you could get into these really nuance along this whole line. What are some ones that are missing? I think just like your general mappers, where you're just Christina was touching on this. It's the whole config where it's just a huge mapping, and maybe you're using even programming languages in the middle of that mapper to like do really complex things. The key point there, though, is you still need to know a little bit about programming, it seemed, even in this like no code interface. And so I don't want to jump the gun here, but the no code stuff, I'll tell you what, I think it really works well for internal operations where you just have one system and you're trying to go into another. It's something that just needs to work, and you're not trying to scale more than one of these. It really falls apart when you're now trying, in our case especially, you're trying to connect multiple businesses with the same pattern. That's where I think there's a lot to be left with the no code interfaces. I don't know what you have to think, Christina.
Yeah, well, so I was gonna say, like, that's kind of a good. So I think high level, what we want people to understand is, like, this is pretty nuanced. Like, there's no clear cut answers on like what exactly the steps along this spectrum are, and so really it's more important to understand, like, what does my business need, what's important to us, what's important to our customers, and then looking at those things and then trying to decide, okay, which category is going to get me the most of what I need, even if it's maybe not going to be every single thing that I need. And so there you kind of talked about a couple of what you feel like are maybe the weaknesses of more on the no code side of the spectrum. So Christina, maybe you can take us through some of the pros and cons that you feel like there are on that more faux code side of the spectrum. I think Sean kind of covered the weaknesses of no code, so maybe you can tell us some of the strengths and weaknesses of code first.
Yeah. And I think, Lindsay, you touched on something important there too, in thinking about not just what's best for like your business and your business unit within a company, but also the needs of the customer, right? Because in our example, we're talking to software companies who are trying to build these integrations that they're going to offer to their own customers, right? That's a different use case than, using Zapier to like help automate my own business. So really thinking about like, what does your customer need and what experience can they be successful with, I think is really important. And at the end of the day, if anyone, I'm sure nobody here has listened to all of our content, but we did a great like podcast a number of years back with Google talking about #YesCode instead of no code. And the way that I think about it is really like at the end of these no code platforms, like they themselves are built with code, right? There is not a no code, or maybe there is, but even if the no code platform is built on a no code platform, somewhere at the bottom of this piece of software is code. And the reason for that is that it allows you to be more expressive. So you're able to build exactly what you need. And it allows engineers to be more creative with the way that they're designing these solutions. So, I think that there is just an inherent trade-off when you're looking at, simplifying something that is actually inherently a little bit complex and the rigidity that introduces. So if you make something that's inherently pretty complex, very simple, like using, a drag and drop UI, you are going to be introducing rigidity and limitation. That's just a part of the package. And that can be okay. If your use case lines up with what those tools are doing, use them 110%. And we see folks be successful. I'm sure people that are watching this have used Zapier and have been successful, and that's great. Like I would never tell somebody that they have to over design something. But what we oftentimes see is that, when it comes down to actual usage patterns of the end user, there needs to be more flexibility. And the way that you're going to get the most amount of both flexibility and resiliency out of your integrations is by using the tools that are historically used to build software, which are using a programming language and using an engineer. And I think Sean, briefly touched on the fact that often as you start to scale these out or you start to really understand the use cases of your customers, it's not just first name to first name. And maybe that field is, but as you continue to be more and more successful with building these integrations, there will be more complexity, and it can be very frustrating to be limited with what you can do when you have engineers, on your team that can write this stuff and know how to interact with these APIs. So I don't think it is a one size fits all. And I actually think there are hybrid approaches, right? I think there's some instances where something like a low code tool is able to accommodate some really straightforward, low volume types of use cases. But then if you're looking at something that needs to be more flexible and more robust, instead of trying to have an engineer work within the confines of those tools, they can potentially just do whatever they actually need to do by looking at the API docs of that partner and figuring out what needs to be built. So, the con of a code first tool is that our engineers are involved, right? And that is something that some companies, number one, if you're not a software company, you don't have an engineer. Like if you're an accounting firm or if you're a manufacturer or whatever, maybe you don't have engineers and you don't know how to manage engineers and you don't want to just hire someone that you've never talked to before to try to do this, which makes sense. So you're limited in that way. Or if you, again, feel like these other tools fill the need and you don't have the engineers in-house that can work on it, I totally get the appeal, right? And I would say again, use the tool that works for what that works for what you're trying to do, and hopefully don't get yourself locked into something that is not going to be able to work for you in the future. Is sort of where we come into this conversation. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a trauma associated with that. Like specifically, no names, but the idea of even when you do put these systems in place and they start running up, you run into the inherent limitations of what low code are doing. So just to like zoom out, the whole idea behind low code, no code is that by doing these workflow diagrams, the system abstracts away a lot of the complexity away. But a part of that abstracting away the complexity is it leaves you very rigid, and so you can't do certain patterns with no code. And to get into the trauma, I wanted to do a very basic double for loop. Anyone who understands like a minimum of programming will understand. I wanted to have a loop that looped over another loop, and in a low code tool to make that same I had to like create sub processes, and it was like huge like workflows, and it took 6 weeks. This is something that takes 4 lines of code. It took 6 weeks to like express in a low code format, and it just didn't make sense. Like, why are we so not only, and this is actually the point I wanted to make, not only is a non-engineer at scale unable to actually really make these integrations, even the engineers that you end up putting on them are now hobbled by the tool. They're not using the tools that they've learned and the processes that they've had all their career. They're now learning. I mean, we already mentioned MuleSoft. So you mentioned, MuleSoft's like system, and you can only be a MuleSoft engineer, or you can only be blah 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 engineer. I think with a code first, one of the things I really was important to me when making Pandium was like the engineers who are going to ultimately be working on these integrations should go on to be great SREs and DevOps engineers and whatever engineering they want to do, right? Like this shouldn't be like this thing that they never can use again. The skills that they pick up.
Okay. Okay. So there's obviously like a lot to unpack there, but I think sometimes examples can be helpful. So I guess just kind of listening to what both of you were saying, like my main takeaway there is like level of I guess like customization that you need, and then also who's going to be working on it. So maybe I can just speak from at least a marketer's perspective of like if I need something super simple done. So I just know in my past, like one example of maybe using a no code integration that has helped, like we've used Zapier to do something super simple on marketing teams. Like if somebody fills out a form, we want to drop those people into a spreadsheet. Like we're holding a webinar and we want to know who registered, and we want to just auto sync to a Google sheet. It's fine for something like that. And obviously, like I'm not a programmer, I can't program. So the choices are like either I kind of build that Zap in whatever less than an hour, or I need to go tap the engineers on the shoulder and be like, hey, can you build this thing for me that's going to take weeks? And that probably doesn't really make sense. Or I'm going to try to be like stumbling my way through it, or just doing it manually. Like obviously I'd have to like go download a spreadsheet from Zoom or wherever, LinkedIn, and then put it into HubSpot or CRM. So something super simple like that. Like maybe that's a use case where no code makes more sense. But it sounds like from what you guys are saying, like pretty much anything more complicated than that, or anytime engineers are going to need to be involved anyway, like you're better off just kind of giving them the tools that they're used to using, and which is code, and then that gives them like the scalability they need, the customization that they need, and it's not forcing them to like learn any new system or become, like you're saying, Sean, a subject matter expert in some third-party tool. So am I kind of thinking about that the right way?
You're thinking about it great. And to use your same example, like the thing I was talking about, where, okay, you just want to get one event into a spreadsheet. What I was trying to do was like, hey, we need to get all these transactions from the past month into the spreadsheet and then keep it going forward. So the low code lets you get it going forward. It's when you needed any historics or even just slightly more complicated. I think that's where it starts to fail. And to your point, I think you hit it right on the head. It's great for those internal ops. I don't know if Christina, you have anything.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Lindsay. And another thing that folks can think about, and this sort of gets into like evaluation conversation, but is sometimes the complexity of these integrations is not immediately clear. Like you're like, oh, I'm going to move an invoice from my tool to QuickBooks. Like, how hard can it be? And like, if you have a great API and you understand it really well, like Intuit does have a great API, like it's really well documented. And that might be okay with something like like a low code tool. But Intuit is an incredibly large company with an awesome ecosystem, excellent docs. They're just great to work with. The next accounting company that you work with is almost certainly not going to be that. Maybe it will, but like the third one is not going to be. And the complexity of having to post that invoice into that system is not necessarily going to be immediately apparent. And if it's not immediately apparent to you reading, the docs or something, and adding an interstitial layer in between you and that system is going to make it more difficult. So, what our sort of philosophy is, unless it's systems that you are very well aware of, like Lindsay, you mentioned, like Zoom and Google Sheets. Like Zoom and Google Sheets are two companies that have a long history. Like I trust that a low code thing can get, that understands where those registrants are and can put them into the right place once you configure it properly. But typically, if you're a software company, even your own system is not going to be as good as Zoom or HubSpot. So giving yourself the freedom in the future to not be either locked into something that doesn't do what you need it to do, or something that kind of does what you need it to do, but then you're actually building workarounds within it, is something that, I think folks should think about. Like, how much control do you want to give away? Like if you're building this stuff from code, if you're building it with code in-house, you have all of the control, right? If you build 100% on your own in-house and you run it on a server under your desk, like as long as no one trips over that cord, like this is 100% yours, and as much as it can be, right? And then on the low code side is like the very, very opposite. It's like you basically have no control. You're really at the liberty of what that tool allows you to do. And you cannot take anything with you or really change very much about that experience. And I think it depends on your level of complexity, what you guys are trying to do, and also how important these apps are to your customer, right? So like Lindsay, in your example, if for some reason the registration, the participants or whatever didn't get from Zoom into HubSpot, you can go and you can export that spreadsheet, and like you could see in the Google Sheet, like, oh, I can tell it's not syncing everybody, no biggie, I'll just go do the manual thing. If you're a software company and you're offering this app as like a really important part of the workflow for your customers, and getting those invoices into Intuit is how your customers get paid by their customers, it's not acceptable for it to not work. And because of that, you need to build in resiliency that we have found, or I have found over time, can be very challenging if you're not following like engineering best practices, which is something that, using code, whether it's 100% in-house or using a tool like ours or others, enables you to do.
I would just add
there. Go ahead.
Something Christina just said that really intrigued me was the idea of like you have a server that you're gonna like knock over, and that's maximum freedom. Like having a cloud service provider is a form of like low code in some ways on that spectrum, right? For the DevOps team, like, and that gets into like there are aspects of all these tools, especially the integration platforms, where one of them, the iPasses, that I think are really important and are providing a lot of value. It's more, again, just the interface of how you write these integrations that I think we really separate ourselves on. And just the same way most companies now don't actually have servers anymore. Like I don't actually think most companies need to build their own integration platforms. It's the same for every company. They need discovery, they need configuration, they need secret management, they need application performance monitoring, all the things we do. And they need to make it resilient, and it needs to be like, it has to be super fault tolerant if we're going to be powering the systems that we do. And so it's really hard to build that from scratch. And a lot of the time, the integration section of the engineering team doesn't get a lot of the budget. And so it's really hard for these teams to build these things. And I don't want to like totally disparage no code. It's a spectrum, and we're in it. And it's about selective use of it at the right times.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we're already moving to kind of the how people should evaluate this direction. So Christina, you've talked about resiliency, super important. Sean, you kind of doubled down on that and then also said, thinking about what makes the most sense for your team's resources. So what are some other things people should think about? Like if I'm, let's say, like a product manager at a SaaS company, or a partnerships leader, or I'm even an engineer who's been tasked with either leadership telling them, hey, we need more integrations, or maybe they see that customers are requesting integrations and they're maybe losing deals because they're not able to build them, or they're just noticing that integrations would make their product better, and so they want to be building more. So other than maybe resiliency, or thinking about what their team's actually like going to be the best use of their engineering time, what other factors should people be considering when they're thinking about how to choose where they should sit on this spectrum in terms of how much code they're using to build their integrations?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. I know Sean has some feelings on this too. And like like integration work, this has been like most of my career. I know companies don't want to work on this. Like if you're not an integration company, you have not chosen likely to work on these projects. It's like not the cool like AI machine black box thing. It's like it's kind of an operational requirement almost to a lot of companies. So like I get that when you're a product manager or you're someone on the revenue side of the house and you're like, hey, I need that Salesforce integration to like hit our revenue goals, that like the engineering and maybe product orgs are like, this is like not fun, not cool. There's a lot of pushback. And so the extension of that is there's a lot of, it's very attractive to think like, oh, we don't need engineers to do this. Like we're going to have our CX team build everything or like whatever it is. So I get that impulse, like 1,000%. And I think, again, if the low code stuff like fits your use case, like run with it. But that, especially for more complicated systems and again, these mission critical types of things, like it's not going to be sufficient. So I think sort of like almost biting the bullet on that and just being like, look, like this is actually we're building a little baby application to connect two pieces of software that they themselves are written in code. And we are a software company, so we do have engineers. Like perhaps we should treat this like a feature, and we could do a whole webinar on like how integrations actually contribute to like the bottom line in such a direct way, in a way that a lot of features that are released are not like that direct solid line. But the first step is like coming to that consensus, which is like, okay, what kind of humans are we realistically gonna put on this project? Like, do we really think that the CX team is going to be able to do this? I love CX, it's my background, but like, is this realistic? And if we get more down into like, okay, cool, we know engineers have to work on this, but like, how do we want to try to sort of expedite these things? There's obviously like, what does the system do specifically? Like, do they support the use cases we need? But one thing that I think a lot of folks who are looking at this for the first time don't think about is portability. So if for some reason you have to move off of your integration platform, perhaps through no fault of your own, perhaps they are discontinuing support for something, or like you really need something new, you are essentially completely locked into a rebuild. Those low code tools host all the logic, and there's basically no way that I've seen to export anything usable across platforms. So that kind of goes back to control, which maybe this is just me like being a control freak too. Like I want to know that if like Pandium disappears tomorrow or whoever, like we're not totally hosed, and you don't get that with the low code tools. Like you are 100% stuck with them. And if you, God forbid, do have to move to another platform and the person who built the original one is not there any longer or not available to you, it is like reverse engineering this web of shapes typically to try to figure out what this thing did, versus like looking at a code block where like any engineer out of a boot camp should be able to like look at a block of TypeScript and be like, okay, I basically understand what this thing does. So there's the portability of being able to like move between platforms. And then there's also the, Sean alluded to this earlier, the lack of specialization, right? Like any engineer that you hire, hopefully marketing engineers, should be able to pick up a lot of these integrations and just like, they can read API docs. They can look at the app and be like, okay, roughly this is what's going on, versus dropping into a canvas that when you double click, it's another canvas, and you double click, it's another canvas. Very, very difficult to figure out what's going on in that specific tool, even if you have experience using those types of tools in the past. So really, I would say that's a part of the assessment that is often overlooked because it's not a now problem. It becomes a now problem when this works, right? When you only have 2 customers using this thing, it doesn't matter. When you have 2,000, it does matter. And I think if you're looking to solve this problem at all at a software company, you're hoping to get to the 2,000 number. The goal is not to just serve one customer, I hope. Sean, you probably have other thoughts.
I mean, just to double down on that, yeah, like if your goal is to serve 1 or 2 customers, you don't need a bypass. Just build it and just never think about it again. But if it is to eventually serve 2,000, for sure. And you were just talking about like what you need to think about. I think we touched on this a bunch of times, but it's the resources, right? So if you're trying to build this all in house, not only do you need those like junior engineers, those boot campers to build the integrations, you also need the DevOps team to build the entire platform around what they're building so that these integrations are running and your customers are happy, right? We could get into the economics. I know Christine was talking about that. One of the biggest things with these integrations that just blows my mind is just the net retention. You're not losing customers who are integrated. It's too hard to move once you've gotten them integrated. And so you want to focus on having a great experience there. And so, yeah, just the thinking about your resources that you're going to need to put it in charge. Thinking about the entire journey, like how will someone find this integration and install it and use it? I think when you're picking these platforms, sometimes they're just really focused on the integration itself and none of the stuff that goes into finding that integration as an end customer. It's great if you have a QuickBooks integration. If I can't find it as a customer of yours, I'm not going to use your tool if it's important to me. And so having the entire ecosystem covered and like, are these other providers doing that? I think is a really important thing to look at as well. Or like trading it off against internally versus having someone else do it, right? Like, do you want to have to build that discovery layer? It's not trivial and more trauma coming in, but like sometimes you have the biggest goals and you have a year to do it. And then by the end of it, it's become 5% of it, but you also have keyboard shortcuts, which, you know what, you didn't even ask for in the beginning, but
Yeah. That's a great point though. Like just because you build it doesn't mean that they'll come. And so if you put all of your resources just into building and never think about how are we actually going to get people to like discover this and install it, then you're going to go over budget and over time on your project when you realize, oh wait, we actually still need to worry about that part. So maybe what about like the customer service side? Because obviously, like I talked to a lot of our customers, and I know we've had a lot of customers that have migrated from different tools over to Pandium. And a big reason for that I've heard is around customer service, not necessarily to them, but to their customers. So if there's a problem with an integration and it's built on one of these no-code tools, it's kind of like a support black box of you're kind of having to like refer your customer over to that tool. And then they maybe get told, oh, we don't support this. And you're like, well, wait, I don't support it. So maybe tell us a little bit more about you guys. Obviously, maybe Sean, you can tell me more as an engineer, like some of the pitfalls that people have, that we work with, have experienced in terms of the support of the integration if something goes wrong or if they need an update made, and some of the kind of brick walls that get run into with some of these third-party tools there.
Yeah, I think the biggest, and it goes to, again, having like a platform that are running these, is just visibility into what's happening. So from the very start of Pandium, we focused on the ability for a person at our customer's company to actually manage these integrations at scale. In a previous time, like in order just to get a list of users who was using an integration, it required like an asynchronous report to be made out of another system and sent to us. It just didn't make sense. And so I think thinking about, hey, how is my CX team gonna deal with a problem in an integration? There's always going to be problems with integrations. The data itself is made by humans, and humans are fallible. And so, and the logic is made by humans. The logic is fallible. So you're going to need to think about debugging. It's such an important part of it. And it just makes me think of two things. First off, logging, having your access to all the logs. The other is like preventing bugs from getting there in the first place. Um, One of the first things that we did at Pandium is make sure that our integrations are totally, you're able to run them through your CI CD process. So you're able to use testing and basic code review and all that stuff to make sure your code isn't broken before you get there. It's very hard to do that on a low code platform. You're literally, I called it art review. You're like looking at the screen and someone's coming over and giving you editorial comments about how your diagram looks. It's just so not valuable. And it's much better just to use the tools that you're already using. And I think that's another thing should be definitely, it's really important. I don't know if Christina, if you have any like,
Yeah, I mean, with I'm not an engineer for the people on the call here. I just kind of pretend to be one sometimes.
He's great. He's great.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of the low code tools, again, there's a spectrum of low code tools, right? There's like very, very, very simple. I would say like Zapier is a great example of that. It can do pretty complex stuff, but like they've done a really good job of creating UIs that like are easy for a consumer essentially to use, all the way to like the Informaticas and the MuleSofts of the world, which are, sold to companies like Kraft Foods, like really heavy duty, doing massive volumes. And everywhere on that spectrum, there's going to be debugging and customer support. And depending on where you are on that spectrum, those logs are of varying degrees of usefulness. So you may be able to see within a specific workflow or integration that something has failed. Maybe you'll be proactively notified, maybe not. But as a CX person at a software company, trying to like track down what happened, in my experience, is very difficult because again, you're interacting with an opinionated platform that is then articulating to you, the customer support person, like their version of the error. So I can tell you as an example, I was in my office for a very long time, very late that night, trying to troubleshoot this one customer's integration. And like I was looking at a screen and there was like a part of it that was lit up and I was like, it's in there. That's the problem. And so I was like digging through and trying to find logs and going to our prod team and asking them, can you pull the logs from this time? And it was a Chinese character, like broke the whole thing because they had accidentally put a Chinese character, I think, in a currency field. And if I had just gotten the response back directly from QuickBooks, this was an Intuit thing, and I'm sure they fixed this now, but like it would have said, invoice did not sync because SKU non-numeric value or something. Like it tells you these tools, especially the good ones, like give you the information. Even the bad ones will typically say like, 400 or whatever with the record number. So you can at least get like kind of close. But in this instance, it was just like error with like no indication of what I should do. And I think these companies, I'm sure, have improved and they continue to improve. There's going to be like some are better than others in different places around debugging and logging, but you're always interacting with their version of that error. And I was a pretty good CX person. I had a pretty good engineering team that worked for me, and I had a pretty good engineering team that worked beside me, which was Sean's team. And like we could have found that so fast if we had just gotten the direct response back from Intuit. And my CX team could have found it. I didn't need to do it. So this is like that seems like a very specific and like esoteric example, I think. But to Sean's point, data is like always the problem with these things, and not always, but I'd say 70% of integration problems are data issues that were input by a person or another system. And those should be very easy to troubleshoot. And in my experience, that is not necessarily the case. I'd rather just read the direct response from the API, even as a non-engineer. Sean, I'm not going to make you go into further traumas, but and it wasn't just at this specific company. I mean, I've been dealing with this since 2006, right? Like, I remember chasing down fractions of pennies in an ERP for days using a Microsoft workflow tool. Like, it's a baked in part of that low code stuff. Again, simplicity and rigidity. Like, there's just those two things just come together in this specific space.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good reminder. It's like, it's not like when something breaks, it's always a super complicated reason. A lot of times it's a simple thing, but if that thing is hard to find, then that just kind of breaks down the whole system. All right, so let's move maybe a little bit into the kind of like getting other people in the company involved. So we've gone over the high level, we've gone over pros and cons, we've talked about how people should kind of start to think about their integration strategy, questions they should be asking themselves. But obviously, like, integrations don't happen in a vacuum. It involves touches from a lot of different departments. It involves support from a lot of different people within a company. So what are some effective ways that the people that are tasked with these integration projects should go either start conversations or kind of educate people within their company to get their buy-in, to get their support so that these projects can be successful?
I have so many feelings about this.
You should take it. You should take it. Yeah.
So
you should take it.
So I think that this really depends on like what you're trying, like specifically what you're trying to do. If it's like, hey, sales team wants to close our first 6-figure deal, we need a NetSuite integration, like that's a different conversation than like, I want to open up this channel with Intuit and like, I want our customers to be able to find this. I want to be certified in, their app store. So let's focus on the latter, just because the former is basically like, this has to get done to close this deal, which we need to hit our quarterly goals. Like, we're just going to like steamroll it through the org because it has to happen. The latter is more of like a strategic idea, right? For a change in your go-to-market or an enhancement in your go-to-market across your organization. And I strongly believe what it really boils down to is trying to determine what the motivations are for each of the different types of humans that you're interacting with. And I think that these can kind of be boiled down based on the persona. Like if we look at revenue generating people, like motivated by money, right? CX people motivated by customer happiness. So the revenue generating folks are probably like at the very top. They're like, hey, we're going to close more business partnering with Intuit. That's usually enough to be like, cool, let's go talk to product and engineering. Product teams want to work on cool stuff. This is typically not cool stuff. So if you can come to them, to other people, it's cool to me, but if you can come to them with a plan that's like, hey, I have thought about this. Here's our like 3 solutions that I'm thinking about. This is the pricing model. This is what I think are the pros and cons, and like really package it up with a bow and be like, I really would love it if you would just get on the phone with these 3 companies and we could see if there's something here. You're much more likely than wandering over to their desk and being like, I need an integration. They're going to be like, cool, put it on my tab. Talk to you next quarter. And then from an engineering perspective, in my opinion, they want the thing that works and the thing that is going to require the least amount of like thrash and friction in comparison to what they're doing day to day. Right? So the least amount of work, but the thing that does work and the thing that is not going to require that they learn something brand new just to solve this problem. And low code is way on one end of that, and then code is way on the other end of that. And again, I think that all goes back to like who in your org is going to work on these things. But I do think, just going to an engineer and saying, we need this to close a new deal, depending on the engineer or your CTO or whatever, that might work. But more likely they're going to be like, cool, we'll talk about it in quarterly planning. I have roadmap. Versus like, hey, here's some options and different approaches. Some are like really light for you and some are hypothetically, take more work away, but are going to require more learning. It's sort of that trade-off. And anyone who's here listening to this at any point, I'm like more than happy to talk about like how to do this sort of buy-in internally. Because it does pay off in spades. Like we've seen over and over and over and over companies, like when you just take that sort of flyer and you're like, cool, let's just try to build that. I keep going to Intuit. Let's just build that QuickBooks integration. It's not going to take that long, hopefully using the right tooling. And then we'll see what happens. Like the ROI on that for everybody is usually so high in comparison to almost any other random project you're going to pick up. But I do think it's really about aligning incentives with like the specific people that you're talking to, which is a little bit more work, but I think can make you the hero within the organization and make each individual person on your team also look good. And Sean, I don't know if you want to add to that. I was speaking on behalf of engineers.
Yeah, I felt a little offended. No, I think you hit it on the head about what you were saying in terms of like learning versus like I'm gonna have to learn the integration system no matter what. I don't want to have to also learn the tool I'm using, or at least I want that as little bit out of learning as possible. I think just more tactically, uh, what I've seen really been successful for getting buy-in from engineers and the product people specifically is like doing a proof of concept. Like try to build that first integration on the system, get it in front of someone, get that feedback, and um, see if it's valuable as is. Right? I think a lot of um, I find it really interesting the journey that our customers who started out, a lot of them starts with a demo and they're doing a proof of concept, like just to see like the brightness in their eyes by the end of it when they're like, oh wow, this was actually not that painful, or this isn't working and it's totally seems like scalable. Showing can sometimes do a lot to build buy-in, I guess, is my only point. I think what Christina was saying though is key. It's like getting all the stakeholders and stakeholder management.
Yeah. All right. So I know we could all talk about this all day, but we do have to put a pin in it somewhere. So why don't we do this before we jump? We'll try to do a couple Q&As too after this. But if everybody's memory of this webinar got wiped except for one idea, what's the one thing you guys would want them to walk away with? What's the one thing they should remember?
I will say use the tool that's built for the job.
All right.
Code
Leave it
first.
at that. What about you, Sean?
Code first.
Hashtag yes, code.
We're not biased at all.
Yeah, no, but like, really, I mean, I know we got to put a pin in it, but like, people that have talked to me and Sean actually out in the world would know that like, I'm the first one. If you could find an easier, like, better way to solve the problem than, involving engineers or whatever you don't want to do, like, go do that. I'm not here to tell. I don't think there's any one solution to these things. And tech changes constantly. But I think I'm happy that we are able to offer an alternative if that model doesn't work for you.
Yeah, we joke about being biased, but it's not like that bias is coming from nowhere. It's like you guys have a lot of experience in this space. You've talked to a lot of people. You've tried a lot of stuff, and it seems like this is where logic has landed us. So, all right. So we did have a couple people that sent in questions ahead of time. So we'll try to get a couple of those. So first one, if we've already started down one path with integrations but realize that it's the wrong one for us, how can we go about course correcting?
Sean, you want to take it?
I mean, I'm just going to speak from the top of my head.
Build a time machine is.
No, I think there's a question of like sunk costs and the sunk cost fallacy, and like, are you just keep on throwing work at something that's not going to work? I think at least here with Pandium, like you don't have to abandon any of that work. Like we make it easy to run your integrations anywhere, including on Pandium. And so like, just don't think because you started on one platform, you can't make a decision to change platforms. It being possible to go onto another system and at least with Pandium, like you don't have to start over. You can continue to get the value out of that and then eventually migrate over if you want. Just don't keep on suffering would be my advice.
Yeah, I agree. Like pull the Band-Aid off, because the more people that you onboard onto that tool, the harder it is going to be to offboard, because you're going to have to move people. And I'll also say, like, if you're going from one integration platform to another, and, there may be like real specific things about your current tool that you don't like, oh, with this specific connector, it doesn't support this thing. And you'll go and, assess in a couple of other vendors and they might say, oh, we support that one thing. But like, what's the next one thing going to be? So I think looking at it holistically in terms of like their approach versus the specific feature of a specific app or something will help you from getting stuck in that place again. We talk to a lot of companies that have 2 iPasses, 3 iPasses, plus some homegrown stuff, because they're like constantly chasing that one thing that doesn't work. And, I think you guys can understand that we have thoughts about the entire model and why that is, but like just be really thoughtful about it, because it is going to be rebuilding and moving folks around as you do this.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question is, it seems like different people in our company care about short-term needs versus long-term needs more. So like how they're weighing them. Like how should they go about balancing that? And I think what they're getting at here is people think in the short term, like simplicity is better, but in the long term, like scalability is better. So how should people kind of think about balancing those when it comes to integrations?
So I actually think this has a lot to do with your maturity as a business. Um, like if you're a company that is small and new and like you just need to have some social proof around, partnerships or ecosystem or something, I think that like an integration platform, to Sean's point, is probably overkill, but like you can get away with a lot of like the low code stuff, just to like check a box and then you deal with that later. Like I don't think starting with the wrong quote unquote tool is the right way to go, but like there's just a speed element that can come with just having to check that box. If you're a more mature company and if you're a more mature company and you have customers that have been with you for a long time, there's an expectation of the quality of the product that you're delivering. And whether you use an iPaaS or you build in house or whatever, like your customers are going to expect that this integration, if you're offering it to them, is something that you support and that you're proud of. So thinking about like, how do you make sure that you can get to that place without, as we just discussed, like a ton of thrash around moving vendors, I think is important, right? And that's not like a great answer, but I do think we could get into like I could go through all the like individual features and what to look for, but like it really comes down to what kind of volume do you think you're going to be looking at, and like how important are these things to you? And if you're a 3-person company just trying to close a customer and you need that Salesforce integration, like just hack that together and get that contract. Like I'm here for it, but you don't need a Pandium. But if you have, 1,000 employees and you have 10,000 customers and some subset of them want to use that Salesforce integration, it's really important to think about the LTV of your own customers. How long do they stay with you? And what's going to enable you to move the most quickly to iterate and continue to support these folks over time. Sean, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
That was very well said.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, maybe. So somebody asked, how should we prioritize which integrations we build first?
Yeah, I think it's simple as simple. It's not simple. It's just doing the balancing act of like what's going to close the most business first for you and like time to market. I think I would argue, at least on the first one, that you work on a system that's a little bit more well known, so you don't get too messed up by the idiosyncrasies of a particular system. So we keep on using Intuit or MailChimp, or I mean, we can name some of our customers. But anyway, the idea is that you find one that's really high value and you can get some real social proof from, but also I think is also well known, so that it doesn't seem like a one-off. I don't know what are your thoughts.
No, I mean, I agree. I think don't go for that like crazy esoteric system that doesn't have documented APIs and all this stuff, because like you're just setting yourself up for it to be even more painful. Almost certainly, no matter what industry you're in, there's like some accounting tool, some CRM, some MarTech tool that you can connect to that has like a really nice API and like, is not that challenging, at least from that perspective. Like cut your teeth on that. don't go in. That'll also allow you to have a quick win with your like the rest of your team. So it's not like, oh, Christina said she was going to build this XYZ integration, it would take 3 weeks, and now it's been 9 months and it's still not live. Like you want to minimize the amount of potential risks there.
Yeah. All right, I lied because we just got a good question and I think other people get some value out of. So it's Sean, when you learn a new platform or environment during an integration build, does the time to build get shorter for the next one?
Oh, yes, very much. Well, the time gets shorter. Does it get like a lot shorter? Is like, what is shorter? So if it takes me 6 months on a low code platform to get an integration out, and then because I now have spent the first 8 weeks of that learning the system, yeah, I can get some speed up from that. But I think it comes down to how much of a speed up you can get. I think on a system like Pandium, where we're very much out of the way, you get that first integration done, you're now working on your next one right away. You get this huge speed up. Anywhere from like maybe it's 4 weeks on your first integration, you're down to 1 week on your next one. We had one customer, they banged out after the first integration, which took them like 3 weeks, and it was mostly because they didn't have an API yet. They've been able to successfully bring on another 20 in the same amount of time. Sorry about my camera. And so, yeah, I think you definitely learn a lot about the platform.
There's also, and I know we're at the top of time, but I always like to say there's a lot of patterns in all these integrations, like whether it's MarTech or EdTech or FinTech, like data is data is data. It's all formed a little bit differently, but there's only so many ways to like move this stuff between systems. So if you guys are trying to start down this path and like you really want to have high acceleration, having, if you can find like a PM or somebody that's solution consultant or something that has done this before, you'll get a lot of velocity, not necessarily on the build part, but on the not rebuilding part, because they know the gotchas, they know the patterns, they know the sort of like loopholes and stuff. Even if they've never used those systems before, you could just kind of look at these things after doing it for a certain period of time. So that helps make the engineering's lives easier because they don't have to refactor all this stuff after the fact.
Cool. All right. I think we call it a wrap there. If you have made it this far as a listener, thanks for sticking with us. If you want to continue this conversation with us, I know Sean and Christina's DMs are always open, or you can hit us up at pandium.com or follow us on LinkedIn. And we will see you in the next webinar. We have one coming up next Thursday. So it'll be about buy versus build when it comes to integration. So that should be a good one. We've got guests from Just Uno, who's one of our customers. So we're excited to talking to you more about that. And hopefully we'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.